Anybody here that doesn't know our next speaker, why are you here? Who are you? The River District's own Eric Kuhn, our general manager, is our next speaker. This is Eric's, we've called it his swan song. This is his last presentation as general manager of the Colorado River District, as he has announced his retirement at the end of the year. The board has been working diligently on identifying a replacement, well, and that's not the right word, a successor to Eric as the general manager. Eric is going to provide that Upper Basin perspective, do a little reality work on our own drought contingency, drought planning efforts. Please welcome Eric Kuhn.
Well, thank you. Thank you. First, I want to thank the River District staff who's been working on this program for a long time. You guys have done a great job. And as Chris said, this is not my last conference. It might be my last conference as a River District employee, but I intend to come back. In fact, I think I might have more fun when I come back. Imperial Irrigation District, huh, Bill? How's the kayaking down there? How about the winter skiing? Is it good? You know, no advice on that, huh? All right.
Kayak on the Salton Sea.
Kayak on the Salton Sea, yeah, I guess as it recedes, right? Yeah, and what I want to do is just give you a little bit of a West Slope and an Upper Basin perspective on what's going on the Colorado River system in general. I think it was a great presentation by Bill, understanding what's happening in California, what's happening in Arizona, but especially what's happening in California has sort of been the key to the Colorado River for a long, long time. So I'm sort of going to back the clock up about 100 years to about 1917. And ironically, the conditions, if you want to call it, and the politics of 100 years ago were very similar as they are to what they are today. So we know we've all talked about the Colorado River Basin. Just a couple of interesting facts here. Whoops. About 90% of the water in the basin originates above that mythical place called Lee Ferry. Lee's Ferry is a real place. That's where we put in if you're going into the canyon. Lee's Ferry is also a place where they had a ferry and they have a gauge today. But Lee Ferry is a point 1 mile downstream of the confluence of the Prairie River and the Colorado. And it's the magic point in the Colorado River Compact that divides the basins. So it's slightly different than Lee's Ferry. So I try to use the term Lee Ferry when I'm talking about compact and Lee's Ferry when I'm talking about the river. But about 90% of the water originates above. But as Bill and others have said, most of the people in the basin live in the lower basin. It's not unlike Colorado's situation where most of the water starts on the west slope. Most of the people live in the east slope. And in fact, if you look at what's Colorado's contribution to the flow of the Colorado River, it's over 70%. It's between 70 and 75%. And actually most of that either flows through or originates here in the Colorado River District. So it's always important to us as to what's going on. Further, within the Colorado River District alone, our depletions make up about a little over 50% of the Upper Basin's depletions. We historically have been very active in Upper Colorado River Basin issues, and I point out that within our district, including a lot of trans-mountain diversions, we consume more water in the River District than the other 3 Upper Basin states combined. So we are an important player. Western Colorado is an important part of the Upper Basin. In many ways, we're the heart of the Upper Basin, and we're the heart of the Colorado River in terms of yield. So 100 years ago, we were in a wet period. The Colorado River was considered a menace. It was unruly. It created the floods that Bill talked about that created the Salton Sea. It also flooded Yuma in 1917. It was a variable river. It was a beast at that time in terms of a river. Its flows during the May through June period, May, June, and July, were many times its flows in August, September, and October. So you had too much water in the spring, and by the early 19-teens, you did not have enough water in the fall, not enough water for the Imperial Irrigation District and the existing irrigation uses in the lower basin. So we were already seeing shortages at certain times of the year in the Colorado River system, and shortages here in the Grand Junction area. So the threat to the upper basin, and then this is really important, what was the threat? And what were the politics of the time? The threat was a good old friend, prior appropriation. There was a little-known case that's really well-known in those of you who watch the compact issues between Wyoming and Colorado on the Laramie River. Some developers in Colorado wanted to tap the Laramie, which is a tributary to the North Platte that originates in the mountains to the west of Fort Collins. It flows north into Wyoming, where it ultimately reaches the Platte River up in southeastern Wyoming. That had been developed relatively early by Wyoming ranchers and by farmers in Wyoming. Come along in the early 1900s, Colorado wants to do a trans-basin diversion out of the Laramie into the South Platte. And Wyoming sues and says, you're going to hurt our users that were unquestionably had a senior priority. But at the time, no one understood how interstate water law would work. They knew how it would work within the state, intrastate, but nobody, it was just, we were a new country, and interstate water law was a new field. But what the court did in that case was say, where there are two states, like Wyoming and Colorado, both of those states have prior appropriation doctrines. Both of those states are co-equals under federal law. Under the Constitution, states are equals. And Wyoming had an equal right to that water, and both being prior appropriation states, the prior appropriators in Wyoming on the North Platte had senior rights to the proposed development in Colorado on the Laramie River, and that essentially made that project infeasible. It also caused folks like Delph Carpenter, who before he was the Colorado River Compact Commissioner was the special counsel to Colorado in that case, and it caused him to realize that the application of prior appropriation throughout the Colorado River Basin would be a huge threat to the development of Colorado. So what was the Colorado River Compact? There's a lot written about it, but I really consider it a political and a social contract among the states so that it put off the application of prior appropriation as between the two basins, the upper basin and the lower basin. Initially, they tried to do it among the states. They just couldn't get there. So it's easier to divide up something among two entities than it is seven. So they said, it's a document that will allow us to proceed with prior appropriation in 7 states and proceed with the development of the Colorado River, because we in the upper basin would not be subject to those downstream senior rights like we were in the Laramie case. And why did the lower basin need it? It was really Bill's predecessors that developed the Colorado River. They needed it because they wanted Hoover Dam. It was called the Boulder Canyon Project Act. What they wanted was a large dam on the main stem of the Colorado River for hydroelectric power generation, for water supply regulation, and for flood control. Flood control was a huge part of the politics of the 1920s, and it is one of the reasons we have Boulder Canyon, is to prevent the kinds of things that Bill talked about earlier in terms of these floods. So Boulder Canyon, so the lower basin needed the upper basin, or California really, Nevada and Arizona were kind of, in their own world. But California needed the Upper Basin because they needed their political support in Congress. And the Upper Basin needed California because we wanted an agreement to put off the application of prior appropriation. So what the compact did is allowed us to proceed to create the political coalitions in the United States Congress to develop the river. And that's what we did with the 1928 Act. That's what we did in the 56. Arizona and California kind of took their own view. They went to court. In the 1940s, the Upper Basin got together with an Upper Basin Compact. So that's all history, but that's all important. Again, what is the Colorado River Compact? It's a social contract. It's a political contract that allowed development to occur or allowed the coalitions to develop, to move forward with development. So where are we today? Well, let's talk about allocations, because I think we really need to talk about real problems and not paper problems. Unfortunately, with compacts and decrees, we sometimes get focused on what it says in the paper and what's not going on that piece of paper, and what's not, and not what's happening in the real world. Well, in the compact negotiations, they didn't do it 50-50. They actually split the river into four ways. They had $7.5 million for the upper basin, $7.5 million for the lower basin, an additional million acre feet for the lower basin, and then a surplus. And that surplus was critical to the politics of the day. It even talks about it in paragraph 1, or the opening article of the Colorado River Compact. Its purpose was to make a partial apportionment of the available water and to provide for water for future apportionment, because they knew they didn't have perfect knowledge in 1922. So this is what they did. And they ultimately, with the 44 treaty, they allocated 17.5 million acre feet of apportionment. It's kind of like a paper water right. I can have a water right for 100 CFS on a stream that flows 2 CFS year-round. I still have a water right. Doesn't mean I'm going to get the water. So those were apportionments. Additionally, the compact provided, from the upper basin's perspective and the lower basins, there's really only 2 flow obligations, if you want to call it. One is the 75 million acre feet over 10 years at Lee Ferry. And the second is Mexico. The treaty happened after Mexico, but everyone in the room that was negotiating the compact understood that there would be a treaty with Mexico, and they knew they had to have the contingency in the compact in case it happened. And essentially, the agreement that Carpenter put on the table on behalf of Colorado was each basin would have an obligation for 50% of the compact if there was no surplus. And question of what happened to the surplus is like, that's a week's worth of talk. So 100 years later, where are we? Every drop of water of the system is used. I think there's no one that can disagree with that. Since 1998, except for the pulse flow, except for what we designed, not a drop of water has made it from the mountains of Colorado or Utah or Wyoming to the Gulf of Mexico. So the system is fully used. We have a very complex, integrated, really well-functioning in many ways management system. We have storage about 4 times the annual discharge. We have the storage capacity. Most of that is in Lake Mead and Lake Powell, but there's a lot of other storage out there. And where are we today in terms of what are the issues on the table? Well, right now, because of development, agriculture has the senior rights, and the big municipal providers, like Denver Water, like Central Arizona Project, Las Vegas's Southern Nevada Water Authority, Bill's Metropolitan Water District, because they came along after agriculture, they have the junior rights. So that is the problem we have today. We have a fully used system. And because of our property rights system in each state, and because of the development of the law of the river, we have senior rights that belong to agriculture and junior users who are large cities. And the reality is, and we all have to accept this, water needs certainty, Denver needs certainty, big municipal providers need certainty of supply. Doesn't mean they can't do major conservation efforts. They have and they will. They've been very successful, but they need certainty of supply. Now, where are we today in terms of, remember I said 8.5 to the lower basin, 7.5 to the upper basin, 1.5 million to Mexico. What's our current uses? And I've rounded this off to the nearest 500,000 acre-feet to make the math look good. Upper basin uses, including our reservoir evaporation and things like Lake Powell, and we're going to hear about that at lunch, 4.5 million acre-feet. Lower basin mainstream, by lower basin mainstream I mean from Lake Mead essentially down to the border with Mexico, 7.5 million. Lower basin losses and evaporation, about 1.5 million. It's actually more like 1.0 to 1.4 depending on the size, but it rounds off to 1.5 real nice. Lower basin tributaries, something we really haven't talked about for a long time, but there are tributaries in the lower basin, like the Gila. California doesn't have any. Arizona's got a few. Nevada has a little tiny one. But they're using about 2 to 2.5 million acre-feet of consumptive use. Not a drop of that makes it to the mainstream. So that's sort of a different subject, one that we've sort of ignored for the last 20 years, and maybe we're going to ignore it forever. It kind of depends on our appetite for litigation. So a total, there's 17.5 million acre-feet. So boom, we apportion 17.5 million acre-feet. We're using about 17.5 million acre-feet. But of that, it's 15 million acre-feet on the mainstream. Okay, by mainstream, the main channel of the river. What's happening to upper basin uses? And quite frankly, they've flattened out. This is from the Consumptive Uses and Losses report generated by the states and the Bureau of Reclamation. It's not perfect information, but it's by far the best available. It's published by the Bureau. Whoops. And you can see a trend line here, nonlinear, but a good fitting, best fitting trend line. And you can see it really has, since about 1985, 86, as a practical matter, the upper basin consumptive uses have been flat. I think part of that is due to good conservation on our part, and another part of it is due to the fact that we have urbanization in the upper basin in agricultural areas, and we don't have any new agricultural projects. Congress, in the 60s and 70s, quit subsidizing agricultural projects on the West Slope. And you can see that in this trend line. So what about hydrology? Our hydrology on the river has always been extremely variable. We're going to show that. It's always been, and here's Lee Ferry. You can see that from 2000 to 2013, we averaged natural flow that's unaffected by man, about 12.1 million acre-feet. It's about the same as it was from 1953 to 64, except it's 2 years longer in terms of that drought. And the last 30 years, it's been about a little over 13. If we go from 1906 to 2014, there's this magic about 1906. It's when we start the natural flow database that we use for modeling. And it was picked because maybe we had enough information to determine how much water we had in the tributaries by 1906. Maybe we didn't. We could have picked 1921. We could have picked earlier. It wasn't when we started gauges. We actually have gauge information on the river all the way back to 1878. So you can see there's a wide range. I haven't included climate change in here because, quite frankly, I do not have a lot of confidence right now in the climate change traces. It doesn't mean I don't have confidence in the models or the direction, but when you convert precipitation in places like western Colorado, if you convert climate to precipitation, it's really ugly, and when you convert that precipitation to runoff, it's even uglier. So we need to work on that, and we need better information, but I don't have it here, and I think it's in this range. So there was a period in the 1100s where we averaged about 12.5 million acre-feet for over 50 years. I think that really should be the gold standard into what we should look at in terms of management. So here's the famous Bureau of Reclamation graph that starts in 1906. I just happened to update that with gauging or with information on flows that go back to 1878. And by the time the compact was negotiated, there were reconstructions of flows at Lee Ferry and Laguna back to 1878. We just didn't like that information that was out there, and we chose to ignore it. But if you look at what happened, this is where the compact was signed. That was that incredibly wet period from about 1900 to about 1930. Here's 1922. As you can see, there have been periods of more stable low flows around 13.5 million acre feet that have really dominated the hydrology, with the exception of what I call the Rocky Mountain High here in the late 70s and early 80s, when we had the really high flows and the really, everybody was running to Colorado to go skiing. So mainstream water budget, there's about 15 million acre feet of water available, or a demand on the system. The mainstream supplies are Lee Ferry plus the tributaries. There's a couple tributaries between Lee Ferry and Hoover Dam. And they vary from about 13 to a little over 15 million acre feet. So I'm just showing you that for most hydrologies, we're really in the deficit right now. If you want to include that big 1900 to 1930 period, you can make a case for maybe a small surplus, but we're fully used. Some of the realities, I'll just go through these quickly. This river governance that we're going to have to look at in the future, and it's really evolving in this way. It has to be flexible to consider a wide range of futures. We need to be able to look at droughts like we just went through in 2000 to 2013. We need to be able to handle some maybe big wet years. What happens if we had a California 2017 year in Colorado in a couple of years, and we have a 30 million acre foot runoff into the Colorado, into the system? We need to be able to handle that. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but it easily could happen. The other question is, what's going to happen to consumptive use in the upper basin? We always say we're growing, we have a right to use 7.5. We're unlikely to be able to use more than 4.5 million acre feet over the next 30 years for simple reasons. What's going on in our growth, urbanization on the west slope, and the fact that we don't like trans-mountain diversions. And yes, I agree. We should not support a new trans-mountain diversion because it would put at risk everything we're doing on the east, on the west slope. So how far can the 1922 compact be bent without breaking? And my observation is a long way. See, this compact was bent from day one. Basically, the ratification article said, takes all 7 states. Arizona refused. So what do? We said, well, Arizona, tough luck. We're going to ratify it with 6. So it wasn't, the ink was basically not quite dry on signing the compact when they decided that it needed to be flexible. The compact says navigation is not a use. Congress said, nah, we don't like that. Navigation is one of the primary purposes of Hoover Dam. We said, okay, we'll live with that. So the compact has always been a very bendable, essentially Pat Mulroy says, it means what the 8 parties, the 7 states in the United States, it means what they agree that it means. And that gives us lots of flexibility to do lots of things in the future. Realities continued. The lower basin will have to make the lion's share because we went back there and said the lower basin is using far more than its 8.5. We're using less. So the lower basin is going to have to make the lion's share of future cutbacks. And I'm here to tell you, they are doing that. They have a DCP, a drought contingency plan in place that will reduce their uses. I'm assuming it's going to be approved by including Mexico up to 1.5 million acre feet a year. That is an enormous amount of cutbacks in the lower basin. So they are doing that. Should the upper basin be concerned? Yes. Should we be cutting back? Not as much. We don't use as much. But we also have problems. The upper basin is at risk during these big droughts like 2000 to 2004 and 1950s when we simply don't have the physical supply available to us because we're upstream of the reservoirs. So we've got to do things in these drought periods. The lower basin sees the summation, if you want to call it a 40 years hydrology, we see a 4-year drought. And that's the difference of being upstream of 50 million acre feet of storage and downstream. So the upper basin's drought contingency plans can't totally rely on better management of our storage, and we're going to be doing that. We have to be prepared to do some things to cut back our consumptive uses in the future. And I want to show you, this is what I like to say is, these are the big droughts that impact the upper basin. You can see where this is total storage in Meade and Powell. This is caused by, these two are caused by hydrology. There's another one here in the 50s, when the basin was about 40% as developed as it is today, that if we were to go through that 50s drought, it would hit us almost as hard as 2000 to 2004. And some providers like Denver Water, it still hits their system harder than 2000 does. You know, so in the 50s, if we were to have a 50s drought, we would right now probably drain Lake Powell unless we did something to prevent draining Lake Powell at our current uses of about 4 and 4.5. Same thing with a 2000 to 2004 drought. Our success needs to be going into these droughts with a lot of water in reserve, with keeping Powell full, or fuller. We're not going to keep it full, but we're going to keep it as full as we needed for protection. So some of the West Slope issues, same things have been around for years. We need to preserve West Slope economic opportunities, agriculture, recreation, water quality, water for industry, all of the things that we've been fighting for 80 years. Within Colorado, West Slope agriculture makes up 99% of our what we call pre-compact rights, those rights that cannot be impaired by the 1922 compact. Most of the junior rights are Trans Mountain diverters, but we also have junior rights on the West Slope. Some of our municipal supplies, some of our snowmaking, and some of the industrial uses we have are all post-compact rights. But largely who owns and who uses the pre-compact rights, it's West Slope agriculture, and many of them are here in the Grand Valley. And the other thing we need to be very diligent to is that rural upper basin, and I include the West Slope, but I also include Wyoming and parts of Utah, you know, we can't be the sacrifice zone for the basin cities. And the other thing we want to look at in the next few years is this, or the next decade or so, is the West Slope ag water systems, those that you rely on here for the Grand Valley are over 100 years old. They need major infrastructure investments to keep them going for the next 100 years. How are we going to fund that? I think that's going to be one of the biggest challenges facing my successor is how do we bring money in to preserve what we've got? So West Slope realities. West Slope ag really is now, and let's admit it, let's be candid about it, West Slope ag has become a source of supply for not new taps, for not new water, but for certainty for existing Trans Mountain diversions that need certainty, that cannot afford to be shut down by compact issues. So what do? They go to senior ag rights temporarily or in the long run, and there's this tension there that we're seeing, and it bothers me a little bit. Because we're doing two things. We have a West Slope Water Bank work group that we wanted to start and look at these issues. From the Front Range's perspective, they didn't like it. It was too inclusive, it was too slow, and it was called a research project. And the reason it was called a research project is we engaged CSU, Dr. Perry Cabot if you're here, and we said, what will happen to these things? What will happen to soil health? What will happen what will happen to agriculture if we do this? How long does it take to recover? We have different types of crops than they have. So we wanted to know this, and we were really criticized for being too inclusive and too slow, and you wanted to know too much information. So in my view, the System Conservation Pilot Project in the Upper Basin, which is different than the Lower Basin, there's a different objective in the Lower Basin. In the Upper Basin, it was designed, the pilot was to show that if we're going to if we have enough money, we'll find enough agricultural users in the Upper Basin that would be willing to sell out if they needed to. So we can manage this problem because we have the money. I think that is the message of the System Conservation Pilot Projects in the Upper Basin. And I want to say that's very different than the Lower Basin, where they have a handful of big irrigation districts where we have thousands of smaller users up here. They have big entities that they're dealing with. So the West Slope and the Front Range have opposite interests under the 22 Compact. The West Slope wants to preserve what it's got. The East Slope entities, which are largely junior, almost all junior, they have a certainty issue. And new trans-mountain diversions are really not the big issue that I'm concerned about. The big issue is how do we preserve certainty for existing users and do it in a way that we don't get into a big fight here between rural and urban Upper Basin. Moving forward, like 100 years ago, we need a political or social compact or contract. We could use the umbrella of the 22 Compact. It works perfectly fine. It's been bent in different ways. But this contract has to be between ag and municipals, not between the Upper Basin and the Lower Basin or between Arizona and California. We need to have an understanding that as the municipal entities seek certainty, which they're entitled to, which they're going to do because that is a threat to their fundamental purpose, which is to serve water, then they need to do it in a way that understands and protects and preserves what we have in western Colorado and the rural Upper Basin as well. So a good outcome would be something where we would never have a curtailment on the river. I think that would work for the Lower Basin. I think it would work for the Upper Basin. I think there are some ways we can do that, and we should be exploring those. But to do that, we're going to have to go to the table. We're going to have some real discussions with real facts and not with expectations or mythology that began 100 years ago. Questions?
Any questions that if you would raise your hand, and one of the things I forgot to mention was we've got a couple runners here that will bring you a microphone. And then so, Commissioner Richards, question for
Yes.
Either of our panelists, please.
Well, I think it'd be a little more focused on Eric. It's a little Colorado-based, and thank you both for the very thorough presentations. I just wanted to ask, the term existing users need certainty, which of course I agree with and others do. I just am wondering, how much do we consider the recreationalist existing users and people who really are depending on a good flow and a healthy flow to be able to have their fishing guide experience, have their rafting experience, have the tourism experience? It just seems to be such a dispersed use with no real single advocacy group that it isn't mentioned that often. I saw recreational once on the slides, and I realized the interrelationship between ag water and recreation water, but how are we working to protect and apply certainty for the environment and recreational economy? Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. A good question, if you heard it, is how do we bring in recreation? We need to first remember that recreation is a non-consumptive use. Compacts deal with consumptive use. They deal with uses that take water out of the system, export it or evaporate it. And recreation uses, to our benefit, are almost primarily non-consumptive. In my experience, the best way to assist in terms of recreation is to protect those very senior ag rights. They're at the bottom of the river, like the Grand Valley Project, because when we have a healthy, good water quality here in Grand Junction or in Montrose or in Durango, the headwaters benefit from that. And I think that's been the experience of the River District in the last 25 years, is we do have a coalition, we do have a unified interests on the West Slope in preserving both water supplies for traditional agriculture, the water quality, and the recreation, getting it to them. We have many tools to manage it and get it to them in a way that really benefits recreation.
Thanks. And one more question. Commissioner Stegelmeyer. See? Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Karn. I have a microphone in somebody's hand right here.
Eric, what's the total of present perfected rights on the Colorado River?
Well, you mean the pre-compact rights, those that would be considered present perfected from a compact perspective? It's about half of the 4 million. It's about 2 million among the states. Colorado has a little more than half of that, maybe 1.1 to 1.2 million in the Upper Basin.
Do those rights have priority over all the states?
Well, basically what the compact says is that they can't be impaired by the compact, and nobody knows what that means. And quite frankly, if we got into knockdown, drag-out litigation, I don't know what the outcome of that would be. But the general understanding in both the lower basin and the upper basin is those rights that existed prior to the compact should not be affected by actions that were required to meet the compact provisions. That's a little bit of a technical legal answer, but the bottom line is they have a preferred status in many ways.
Commissioner, more importantly, River District Director, Kuhn Stegelmeyer.
Thank you. Thank you, Eric. I'm really intrigued by your final slide and the idea of a social contract between ag and muni. And I'm wondering if you could shed a little more insight on that. How do you see that? Are you talking about one big agreement, lots of small agreements that lawyers would love? And do we have models for that? I'm just really intrigued on a little more insight on that.
Yeah, great question, Kuhn. I think we want a principle first, which is the big agreement that if you're going to rely on agriculture, if you're going to rely on rural economies to provide certainty, then the way to do that is through cooperative programs and not through just an outright purchase. And I think there are good models in the lower basin, and there are some bad models in the lower basin. But generally, what's happening in California is more positive than negative, in my view, on that approach. I think it would then require, if we can agree in principle, then implementation would probably be through many different smaller agreements. So the lawyers will get their chance.
Thank you all. Bill, any final word that you want to offer either on that or as a parting shot from the lower basin?
We support recreation flows as well.
Very good. Especially because they're non-consumptive in the upper basin.
They get to the right spot, right?
Thank you all.